A former military canine handler bullies a disabled veteran at a local cafe, not realizing his target service dog was the same one that took him down during his arrest 5 years ago. Today, their paths cross again, and old scores will be settled. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Main Street as James Morgan settled into his usual spot at Corner Cafe, the aroma of freshly ground coffee beans filling the air. His service dog, Max, a Belgian Malinois with intelligent eyes and greying whiskers, lay perfectly still at his feet, maintaining the same watchful posture he had developed during his years of military service. The cafe's regulars moved around them in a familiar dance, their footsteps and voices creating a comfortable symphony of small-town life. Sarah, the cafe's owner, approached their table with practiced steps, the gentle clink of ceramic against wood marking the arrival of James's regular order. "Your usual dark roast, James," she said warmly, placing the cup within easy reach of his right hand, "and a fresh bowl of water for our distinguished veteran here." Max's tail thumped once against the wooden floor in acknowledgement, though his eyes never ceased their careful survey of the surrounding area. The morning routine was an anchor for James, a ritual that helped ground him after his return from overseas deployment. The familiar sounds, smells, and textures of the cafe provided a sense of normalcy that had been hard to find since his injury. Each morning he and Max would arrive precisely at 7, occupy their corner table with the wall at their backs, and spend an hour observing the world as it awakened around them. Regular customers had learned to recognize the signs. The way Max's ears would perk up slightly before they approached, the subtle shift in his posture that indicated whether a greeting would be welcome. They respected the space around James's table, understanding that both man and dog had earned their right to peace. Some would offer quiet nods of acknowledgement, others would stop for brief conversations, but all recognized the unspoken boundary that Max maintained with professional courtesy. Today, the cafe buzzed with its usual morning energy. Linda, a retired schoolteacher, was discussing local politics with Tom, the hardware store owner, their voices mixing with the whir of the espresso machine and the gentle clatter of plates. The newspaper stand outside rustled in the spring breeze, and the occasional car passed by, their sounds muffled by the cafe's large front windows. James ran his fingers along the rim of his coffee cup, feeling the warmth seep into his hands. The morning paper lay folded beside him, its pages crisp and untouched. He had developed a routine of having Sarah read him the headlines while she prepared his coffee, a small kindness that had become part of their daily ritual. Max shifted slightly at his feet, responding to something only he could sense in the flow of people around them. The cafe's bell chimed as the door opened, admitting a group of construction workers from the new development down the street. They lined up at the counter, their work boots leaving faint, dusty prints on the polished floor. Max's ears twitched at the new sounds, but his body remained relaxed, having long since categorized these morning regulars as non-threats. James listened to the familiar sounds of their orders: triple espresso for Mike, the foreman, black coffee, and for his crew. Their presence had become part of the morning symphony, their quiet conversations about the day's work blending with the ambient noise of the cafe. They respected the unspoken rules of the space, keeping their voices low and movements measured, conscious of how sudden sounds could affect some of the veterans who frequented the establishment. Sarah moved between tables with practiced ease, her footsteps following a pattern that James had memorized months ago. She paused briefly at his table, refreshing his coffee without being asked. "Weather's turning nice," she commented, her voice carrying the smile he could hear but no longer see. Springs finally decided to show up. The comment was part of their daily exchange, a gentle reminder that the world continued its cycles regardless of personal circumstances. Max's training showed in the way he acknowledged Sarah's presence without breaking his vigilant watch. His body remained alert but calm, a living embodiment of the balance between service and companionship. Years of military service had honed his instincts, teaching him to read situations and respond appropriately, whether that meant maintaining his guard or offering comfort to his handler. The morning light strengthened, warming the wooden tables and creating patterns that James could feel on his face. The cafe's atmosphere remained peaceful, a pocket of tranquility in an increasingly chaotic world. Regular customers continued their morning routines. The coffee machine hummed its constant tune, and conversations ebbed and flowed like gentle waves against a shore. None of them could have known that this ordinary morning was about to become anything but routine. The peace they had all come to take for granted was as fragile as the ceramic cups that carried their morning coffee. And sometimes it takes just one moment, one decision, to shatter that tranquility forever. The peaceful atmosphere of Corner Cafe shattered at precisely 7:45 a.m. when the deep rumble of a motorcycle engine echoed off the buildings along Main Street. The sound was distinctive, almost deliberate in its intensity, causing conversations to pause mid-sentence. Max's ears immediately shifted forward, his body tensing slightly as his training kicked in, identifying the sound not just as a disturbance, but as a potential threat. Through the large windows, patrons watched as a sleek black motorcycle pulled into view, followed by two others. The lead rider, a tall figure in an expensive leather jacket, cut the engine but left the bike positioned at an angle that blocked part of the sidewalk. His movements were purposeful, each gesture calculated for maximum effect, as he removed his helmet and surveyed the cafe with an air of practiced intimidation. James sensed the shift in the atmosphere even before Max's subtle warning signal. A gentle pressure against his leg that they had developed over years of partnership. The morning's comfortable murmur had transformed into something more brittle, filled with whispered observations and the sound of coffee cups being set down too carefully. Even Sarah's footsteps had changed their rhythm, becoming more measured as she moved between tables. The lead rider, whose leather jacket bore the name Commander across its shoulders, took his time arranging his gloves and helmet before turning toward the cafe entrance. His companions, similarly attired but with notably less expensive gear, flanked him like an honor guard. The bell above the door chimed discordantly as they entered, its usually cheerful tone now seeming more like a warning. "Nice place, Commander," announced to no one in particular, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from years of expecting and receiving immediate attention. His gaze swept the room, taking in the morning crowd with the calculated assessment of someone used to sizing up situations and people. When his eyes landed on Max, there was a flicker of something, recognition perhaps, or memory, that caused his confident smile to falter for just a fraction of a second. The construction workers at the counter shifted uncomfortably, their usual easy banter replaced by watchful silence. Mike, the foreman, deliberately turned his back to the newcomers, a subtle act of defiance that didn't go unnoticed. Commander's smile widened slightly at the gesture, as if accepting an unspoken challenge. Sarah emerged from behind the counter, professional smile firmly in place. "Welcome to Corner Cafe," she said, her voice carrying its usual warmth, though her eyes remained cautious. "What can I get for you gentlemen this morning?" The question hung in the air like smoke, waiting to be acknowledged. Commander took his time responding, making a show of studying the menu board while his companions positioned themselves near the door, their posture suggesting they were more interested in controlling the space than ordering coffee. 3 black coffees, he finally replied, his tone making it clear that the order was secondary to his presence and maybe a little local insight. The change in the cafe's atmosphere was palpable. Regular customers began gathering their belongings, some making excuses about being late for work, others simply leaving money on their tables and quietly heading for the door. Linda, the retired teacher, lingered at her table, her years of handling difficult situations evident in her steady gaze and deliberate movements. Max remained perfectly still beside James, but his alertness had shifted from professional observation to focused attention. Years of training had taught him to recognize potential threats, and something about these newcomers had triggered his defensive instincts. His body language communicated volumes to those who knew how to read it. This was not a routine disturbance. "Coming right up," Sarah responded, maintaining her professional demeanor as she moved behind the counter. The sound of coffee being poured seemed unusually loud in the tension-filled space. Commander drummed his fingers on the counter, the rhythmic tapping drawing attention to the scarred knuckles of his right hand. James continued sipping his coffee, his movements deliberately casual, despite the tension he could feel radiating from Max. Years of military service had taught him the value of appearing unaffected in the face of potential threats. He knew that Max would alert him to any direct danger, and for now, the dog's signals suggested watchfulness rather than immediate concern. The morning sun continued to stream through the windows, creating long shadows that stretched across the cafe floor. These shadows now seemed to hold more meaning, like lines being drawn between those inside. Commander's presence had transformed the space from a comfortable community gathering place into contested territory, where every movement and word carried additional weight. Sarah returned with the coffees, placing them on the counter with professional efficiency. "That'll be $9, she said, her voice steady. Commander pulled out a 20 with a flourish, telling her to keep the change in a tone that managed to make even generosity sound like a challenge. His eyes, however, kept returning to Max, as if trying to confirm something just beyond the reach of memory. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Commander lifted his coffee cup with deliberate slowness, his eyes never leaving Max as he took his first sip. The morning light caught the edges of his leather jacket, highlighting the wear patterns that suggested years of use rather than careful maintenance. His companions remained positioned near the door, their own coffees untouched as they maintained their watchful stance. "Beautiful dog you've got there," Commander remarked, his voice carrying across the now quiet cafe. The comment, though seemingly casual, held an undertone that caused Max's ears to twitch slightly. "Belgian Malinois, right? Used to work with them back in the day." He set his cup down with precision, the sound sharp against the wooden counter. James inclined his head slightly in acknowledgement, his fingers remaining steady on his own coffee cup. "He's retired now," he responded, his tone measured and professional. "Just helps me navigate my day." The carefully chosen words carried their own weight, neither inviting nor dismissing further conversation. Sarah moved between tables with practiced efficiency, her actions deliberate as she positioned herself to maintain clear sightlines between Commander and James's table. The remaining customers had settled into an uneasy silence, their morning routines suspended in the growing tension. Linda, still at her usual table, had pulled out her phone, though her attention remained fixed on the unfolding situation. "Retired, huh?" Commander took another sip of his coffee, then began moving toward James's table with measured steps. "Funny thing about retirement. Some skills you just can't forget." He stopped a few feet away, just at the edge of what would be considered polite distance. Max's posture shifted imperceptibly, maintaining his relaxed appearance while adjusting his position for better coverage of his handler. The morning sun had risen higher now, its rays creating sharp contrasts across the cafe floor. These lines of light and shadow seemed to separate the space into distinct territories, with Commander standing precisely at the boundary. The construction workers at the counter had abandoned any pretense of normal routine, their attention focused entirely on the interaction unfolding before them. "Military or law enforcement?" Commander asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. His scarred hands rested casually in his jacket pockets, but there was nothing casual about the way he had positioned himself, angled slightly to maintain view of both James and the cafe entrance. James set his coffee cup down with precision, the gentle click against the saucer carrying through the silent cafe. "Both, actually," he replied, his voice carrying the kind of quiet confidence that came from years of handling difficult situations. Max served 2 tours overseas before transitioning to domestic service. A flicker of something, recognition perhaps, or calculation, crossed Commander's face. He shifted his weight slightly, causing his leather jacket to creak. 2 tours, you say? Interesting timing. Would have been around 2019, maybe early 2020. The question carried more weight than its simple words suggested. Max's ears remained forward, his body still relaxed but alert. To most observers, he appeared to be simply a well-trained service dog, but those with experience could read the subtle signs of his heightened awareness. His eyes tracked Commander's movements with professional precision, cataloguing every shift in position and tone. Sarah had made her way back behind the counter, where she stood with her phone discreetly in hand. The morning's usual playlist had fallen silent, leaving only the soft hum of the refrigeration units and the occasional clink of cups being set down too carefully. The construction workers had begun to spread out, their movements casual but purposeful, as they created a loose perimeter around the scene. "Could have been," James acknowledged, his hand finding Max's ear in a gesture that appeared affectionate but served to communicate readiness between handler and dog. Time tends to blur together after a while. The statement was delivered with a slight smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Commander nodded slowly, as if piecing together a puzzle. "Funny how small the world can be sometimes," he mused, taking another step closer, paths crossing when you least expect it. His voice had dropped slightly, meant now only for James and those immediately nearby. "Ever serve at Fort Benning? The K9 training facility there saw a lot of action during those years." The question hung in the air like smoke, heavy with unspoken implications. Max's tail had stopped its gentle sweeping motion, though his posture remained unchanged. James's fingers continued their steady movement through Max's fur, but his spine had straightened, almost imperceptibly. "Fort Benning has a top-notch program," James replied carefully, his words measured and precise. "Most of us passed through there at some point." The morning sun caught his face as he spoke, highlighting the faint scar that ran along his temple, a reminder of the cost of service. Linda had begun gathering her belongings, her movements deliberately slow as she maintained her position of observation. The construction workers had completely abandoned their previous tasks, their bodies oriented toward the developing situation while maintaining an appearance of casual disinterest. Through the windows, the usual morning foot traffic had slowed, as if the tension inside the cafe had somehow telegraphed itself to the street outside. Commander maintained his position near James's table, his presence creating a subtle disturbance in the cafe's usual morning rhythm. The sunlight streaming through the windows caught the edge of a distinctive scar along his neck, partially hidden by his collar, the kind of mark that spoke of close encounters and narrow escapes. His attention remained fixed on Max, studying the dog's behavior with the practiced eye of someone intimately familiar with K9 training protocols. "Training at Fort Benning was something special," Commander continued, his voice carrying a weight of memory. They had this one instructor there, Sergeant Martinez, tough as nails, wouldn't let a single detail slip. He paused, watching for any reaction. "You remember Martinez, don't you?" James's hand stilled momentarily on Max's fur, a microscopic hesitation that spoke volumes. "Martinez was one of the best," he acknowledged, his tone carefully neutral. "Taught us that a handler and their dog are only as good as their trust in each other." The words carried a subtle emphasis that caused Max's ears to twitch forward slightly. Sarah had begun wiping down the counter near them, her methodical movements allowing her to remain within earshot while maintaining an appearance of routine. The construction workers had similarly adjusted their positions, creating casual but strategic placement throughout the cafe. Mike, the foreman, now stood near the coffee station, his broad shoulders angled toward the developing situation. "Trust," Commander repeated, testing the word as if examining its edges. "Interesting concept in our line of work, isn't it? Never knowing when that trust might be tested." His scarred hands emerged from his pockets, one of them bearing a distinctive tattoo, a military insignia partially obscured by burn marks, or betrayed. The morning light had strengthened, casting shorter shadows across the cafe floor. These shadows seemed to pulse with the tension in the room, stretching and contracting with each shift in position. Through the windows, the usual morning foot traffic had slowed to a trickle, as if the street itself sensed the building confrontation. James's posture remained relaxed, but his fingers had found the specific spot behind Max's ear that served as a silent signal between them, a touch that meant alert but hold. The dog's breathing remained steady, his eyes tracking Commander's movements with professional precision. "Trust isn't just given," James responded, his words measured and deliberate. "It's earned through actions, maintained through loyalty." Commander's smile tightened slightly at the edges. "Loyalty," he echoed, the word carrying a sharp undercurrent. "Like the loyalty shown during Operation Shadowbreak?" The name dropped into the quiet cafe like a stone into still water, creating ripples of tension that spread outward. Funny how loyalty can look different depending on which side of the fence you're standing on. The cafe's ambient noise had dropped to near silence, the usual morning sounds muted by the weight of unspoken history. Linda had abandoned any pretense of preparing to leave, her experienced teacher's instincts recognizing the dangerous currents flowing beneath the surface of the conversation. The construction workers had ceased their casual movements, their bodies oriented toward the confrontation while maintaining their appearance of disinterest. James's hand moved from Max's ear to his shoulder, a gesture that appeared casual but positioned him for better control if needed. "Operation Shadowbreak is classified," he stated quietly, his tone carrying the authority of someone used to giving orders. "But you already know that, don't you, Lieutenant Reynolds?" The use of the rank and name caused Commander Lieutenant Reynolds to stiffen slightly, his confident posture showing the first real crack in its facade. His companions by the door shifted their stance, responding to the subtle change in their leader's demeanor. The morning sun caught the edge of Reynolds' jacket, highlighting a faded patch that had been carefully removed, leaving only the ghost of its stitching behind. "So you do remember," Reynolds acknowledged, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I wondered if the injury had affected your memory." His eyes flicked to the scar on James's temple, then back to Max. "Though it seems some memories are harder to erase than others." Max's posture remained unchanged, but his attention had sharpened, focusing entirely on Reynolds with the intensity of a trained operative assessing a threat. The dog's previous relaxed demeanor had transformed into something more precise, more professional, a subtle shift that only those with experience would recognize as combat readiness. Sarah had stopped her pretense of cleaning, her hand resting near the phone on the counter, The morning's usual playlist had ended, leaving only the soft hum of refrigeration units and the occasional clink of cups being set down too carefully. Through the windows, the street outside seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next move in this carefully choreographed dance of memory and confrontation. Reynolds took another step forward, deliberately crossing the invisible boundary that separated casual interaction from confrontation. "You know," he began, his voice carrying a dangerous edge, "I spent 6 months in recovery after Shadowbreak. 6 months learning to use my hands again." He flexed his scarred fingers, the morning light highlighting the twisted tissue. Plenty of time to think about loyalty, about choices made in the heat of the moment. Max's muscles tensed imperceptibly. Beneath James's hand, the dog's training allowing him to maintain his calm exterior while preparing for any necessary action. The cafe had fallen into complete silence. Even the usual morning sounds of coffee machines and clinking cups seemed muted, as if the building itself was holding its breath. "We all made choices that day," James responded, his voice steady despite the growing tension. "Some of us chose to follow orders, to protect the mission." His fingers remained in contact with Max's fur, maintaining the silent communication channel between handler and dog. Others chose differently. Sarah had positioned herself near the phone at the counter, her movements deliberate as she kept both men in her line of sight. The construction workers had abandoned any pretense of normal routine, their bodies oriented toward the developing situation while maintaining a careful distance. Linda, still at her table, had her phone positioned discreetly, ready to call for help if needed. Reynolds laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that seemed to slice through the morning air. "Orders, is that what you call it?" He moved closer to James's table, his body language becoming more aggressive. "When a handler turns his dog on his own team, that's not following orders. That's betrayal." His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "And some of us don't forget betrayal." The sun had risen higher, casting stark shadows across the cafe floor. These shadows seemed to pulse with the tension in the room, creating sharp lines between light and dark, between past and present. Through the windows, the street outside had grown unusually quiet, as if the whole world was watching this confrontation unfold. James straightened in his chair, his military bearing becoming more pronounced. "The mission was compromised," he stated firmly, each word carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "Max detected the contraband you were trying to smuggle out. He was doing his job, protecting the integrity of the operation." His hand remained steady on Max's shoulder, the dog's muscles coiled beneath his touch, ready but waiting. "Integrity?" Reynolds spat the word like a curse. "You want to talk about integrity?" He reached into his jacket, causing everyone in the cafe to tense, but withdrew only a folded piece of paper. "I carried this report for 5 years, waiting for the right moment." He slammed the paper onto the table, the sound sharp in the silent cafe. "Your dog didn't just detect contraband. He detected a whole operation, years in the making. An operation that would have set us all up for life." Max's attention remained fixed on Reynolds, his training allowing him to ignore the paper while focusing on the real threat. The dog's breathing had slowed, entering the controlled rhythm that preceded action. James could feel the subtle changes in Max's posture, reading the signs of his partner's growing readiness. "So that's what this is about," James said quietly, his voice carrying a note of realization. "You're not here about the past. You're here because you're still trying to run the operation." His fingers tightened slightly in Max's fur, a silent signal of preparation. "And you're worried about what we might remember." Reynolds' face darkened, his pretense of casual conversation evaporating. "Smart boy," he growled, leaning forward to brace his hands on James's table. Always were too smart for your own good. But things are different now, aren't they? His eyes flicked meaningfully to James's scarred temple. Can't see as well as you used to, can't react as quickly. Makes me wonder if your dog still follows your commands as sharply as he used to. The challenge hung in the air like smoke. Heavy with threat and promise, Max remained still, but his attention had sharpened to laser focus, his body positioned perfectly to respond to any aggressive movement. The construction workers had begun to move closer, their steps casual but purposeful, creating a loose perimeter around the confrontation. Sarah had her phone in hand now, her finger hovering over the emergency call button. Linda had stood up slowly, her years of handling classroom confrontations evident in her careful positioning near the cafe's back exit. Through the windows, a police cruiser rolled past slowly, its presence a reminder of civilization's thin veneer over primitive confrontation. "You want to test his training?" James asked, his voice carrying a dangerous calm. "Is that what this is about? Proving something after all these years?" His hand moved to Max's collar, not restraining but ready. "Some skills never fade, Lieutenant. Some loyalties never break." Reynolds straightened, his scarred hands clenching into fists. "Let's find out," he said softly, his voice barely carrying across the quiet cafe. "Let's see if your dog remembers his training as well as I remember mine." His body shifted, subtly, taking on the stance of someone prepared for violence. "Because I've been practicing, James. 5 years of practicing, just for this moment." The tension in Corner Cafe had reached a breaking point when Mike, the construction foreman, deliberately scraped his chair across the floor as he stood. The sound cut through the silence like a thunderclap, drawing Reynolds' attention away from James for a crucial moment. Mike's movement seemed casual, but his positioning placed him squarely in Reynolds' peripheral vision. "You know," Mike said, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone used to managing volatile situations, "I served 2 tours myself. Marines." He moved with measured steps, his work boots heavy against the wooden floor. "One thing you learn, pretty quick, is how to spot the difference between someone following orders and someone following greed." Reynolds' jaw tightened, but his eyes remained fixed on James and Max. "This doesn't concern you," he growled, though his posture had shifted, slightly to account for Mike's presence. "This is between old colleagues." Sarah emerged from behind the counter, coffee pot in hand, her movements deliberate as she approached nearby tables. "Actually," she interjected, her voice steady, "it concerns everyone in here. This is my cafe, and these are my customers." She paused near James's table, the coffee pot a casual prop that positioned her strategically in the developing scene. "And we take care of our own." Linda had risen from her seat, her teacher's instincts for managing confrontation evident in her precise movements. "I've watched James and Max come here every morning for the past 3 years, she stated, her voice carrying the kind of authority that had silenced rowdy classrooms for decades. "They're part of this community. Whatever happened in the past, whatever score you think needs settling, this isn't the place." Reynolds' companions by the door shifted uncomfortably, their confident poses wavering as the cafe's patrons began to move with purpose rather than fear. The morning sun caught the sheen of sweat on one man's forehead, his earlier bravado diminishing under the weight of unified opposition. "Community," Reynolds scoffed, but there was a note of uncertainty in his voice. "You have no idea what's really at stake here, no idea what he and that dog cost us." His scarred hands remained clenched, but his dominant stance had begun to falter. 2 of the construction workers had casually repositioned themselves near the windows, their reflective vests catching the morning light. Their movements appeared random, but effectively cut off any clear path to James's table. Another worker, a former boxer by his stance, leaned against the counter within arm's reach of Reynolds. "Maybe we don't know everything," Mike responded, crossing his arms across his chest. "But we know enough. We know James. We know Max." He gestured around the cafe. "Look around, Lieutenant. Every person in here has a story, has served in their own way. You're not the only one who's faced choices." Through the windows, more regular customers had begun to gather, drawn by the unusual tension in their morning sanctuary. Mrs. Chen from the flower shop next door stood in the doorway, her mourning, deliveries forgotten, as she assessed the situation with sharp eyes. Mr. Patterson, the retired judge, had paused on his morning walk, his presence on the sidewalk adding another layer of civilian authority to the scene. James remained seated, his hand steady on Max's collar, but his posture had relaxed slightly as he felt the support building around him. "The community you're threatening," he said quietly. "These people you're dismissing. They're why we serve. Reynolds, they're the mission we were supposed to protect." Sarah had completed her circuit of the nearby tables, effectively creating a barrier of bodies and furniture between Reynolds and his target. "More coffee?" she asked innocently, though her positioning left no doubt about her intentions to stand her ground. Reynolds glanced around the cafe, finally registering the tactical disadvantage he'd walked into. What had started as a simple intimidation attempt had transformed into something entirely different. The morning light streaming through the windows illuminated a united front of ordinary citizens, each playing their part in protecting one of their own. "You think this changes anything?" Reynolds demanded, but his voice had lost its edge of certainty. "You think hiding behind civilians makes you less guilty?" Linda stepped forward, her phone now clearly visible in her hand. "No one's hiding," she stated firmly, "and no one's looking for guilt or innocence here. What we're looking for is peace in our community. The question is, Lieutenant Reynolds, are you going to be smart enough to recognize when it's time to walk away?" The construction workers had begun a subtle movement, their bodies angling to create clear paths to the door, paths that suggested escape rather than attack. Mike had positioned himself near James's table, his solid presence a clear statement of protection rather than threat. "The police station is 2 blocks away," Sarah added calmly, setting the coffee pot down with a deliberate clink. "Officer Martinez usually stops by around this time for his morning coffee. You remember Martinez, don't you, Lieutenant? Since you mentioned Fort Benning earlier." Reynolds' face flickered with recognition at the name, and for the first time, genuine uncertainty crept into his expression. The mention of Martinez, perhaps another thread from their shared past, seemed to carry special weight. Reynolds' face contorted at the mention of Officer Martinez, his carefully maintained control cracking under the weight of another name from his past. The morning light caught the sheen of sweat on his forehead as he took a half-step backward, his boot heel scuffing against the wooden floor. That sound, that simple scrape of leather against wood, triggered something in Max's training. The dog's ears shifted forward, his muscles coiling with professional readiness. "Martinez!" Reynolds spat, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. "Of course he's here too. The whole damn operation's coming back around, isn't it?" His hand moved toward his jacket pocket, the motion causing everyone in the cafe to tense. "Well, maybe it's time we all faced our past." James's fingers tightened slightly on Max's collar, not restraining but ready. "Think carefully about your next move, Lieutenant," he warned, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had faced worse situations. "Whatever you're planning, it ends here." The construction workers had begun to move closer, their movements casual but purposeful. Mike had shifted his weight to the balls of his feet, his years of marine training evident in his stance. Sarah's hand had moved to the phone on the counter, her finger hovering over the emergency call button. Reynolds pulled his hand from his pocket, revealing not a weapon, but a small flash drive. "You want to know what's really on the line here?" he demanded, his voice rising. 5 years of planning, millions in untraceable funds, and a network that reaches higher than you can imagine. He slammed the drive down on James's table. All of it compromised because your dog couldn't keep his nose out of the wrong crate. Max remained perfectly still, but his attention had locked on to Reynolds. With laser focus, years of training had taught him to recognize the moment when tension transforms into action, and every muscle in his body was prepared for that shift. "The crate wasn't wrong, Reynolds," James replied steadily. "Your choices were. You were smuggling more than money, and you know it. Those weapons were headed to the wrong hands, and Max did exactly what he was trained to do." The mention of weapons caused a ripple of reaction through the cafe. Linda's hand tightened on her phone, and the construction workers exchanged knowing glances. The stakes had suddenly become clearer, the confrontation taking on new meaning. Reynolds' control finally snapped. With a movement born of desperate rage, he lunged forward, reaching for James's collar. "You self-righteous bastard!" he snarled. "You have no idea what you cost us." Several things happened simultaneously. Max exploded into action, his body moving with the precise control of professional training rather than aggressive chaos. The dog positioned himself between Reynolds and James, his warning growl carrying the authority of years of service. Mike and the construction workers surged forward, their movements coordinated despite no verbal communication. But it was Sarah who changed the game. In one fluid motion, she upended a fresh pot of coffee, sending scalding liquid across the floor between Reynolds and James's table. The sudden barrier of hot coffee forced Reynolds to check his momentum, throwing him off balance. Max took advantage of that moment of imbalance. Instead of attacking, the dog executed a perfect blocking maneuver, his body creating a living wall between his handler and the threat. His teeth weren't bared in aggression, but in professional warning, a clear message that any further advance would be met with trained response. "Stand down, Lieutenant," James commanded, his voice carrying the full weight of military authority. "You're not thinking clearly. This isn't Fort Benning anymore, and these aren't your operations to protect." Reynolds teetered on the edge of decision, his body trembling with adrenaline and rage. His companions by the door had begun to back away, reading the shift in power dynamics. Through the windows, the flash of police lights became visible as a patrol car pulled up to the curb. "Officer Martinez," Sarah announced calmly, her voice carrying over the tension. "Right on schedule." The sight of the police lights seemed to break something in Reynolds. His face transformed from rage to calculation in an instant, the survival instincts of a cornered operative taking over. He straightened, adjusting his jacket with shaking hands. "This isn't over," he growled, but the threat in his voice had been replaced by something closer to fear. "You can't protect him forever." His eyes locked onto Max, who remained in his professional stance, neither advancing nor retreating. "And you traitor," he spat at the dog. "You'll remember me." Max's only response was to adjust his position slightly, maintaining the perfect angle to protect James while keeping Reynolds in view. The dog's training showed in every line of his body. This wasn't about aggression or revenge, but about professional duty and protection. The cafe door opened, letting in a burst of morning air and the sound of approaching footsteps. Officer Martinez's voice carried from the entrance. "Everything okay in here, Sarah?" Reynolds made one last attempt to salvage his dignity. "We were just leaving," he announced, his voice straining for casualness. "Just catching up with an old colleague." He began backing toward the door, his movements carefully controlled, but everyone in the cafe knew the truth. They had witnessed more than a confrontation. They had seen the moment when past and present collided, when loyalty and duty stood firm against corruption and greed. As Reynolds and his companions retreated, the morning sun streamed through the windows, illuminating Max's steadfast form, still guarding his handler, still ready to protect what mattered most. The bell above the cafe door chimed one final time as Reynolds and his companions made their exit, the sound somehow different from its usual cheerful tone. Officer Martinez stepped aside to let them pass, his experienced eyes taking in every detail of their retreat. Through the windows, the morning sun illuminated their hurried walk to their motorcycles, their movements stiff with suppressed tension. Inside Corner Cafe, the atmosphere remained charged with residual energy. Max maintained his protective stance for several long moments, his training requiring absolute certainty that the threat had truly passed. Only when the sound of motorcycle engines had faded completely did he allow his muscles to relax slightly, though his attention remained sharp. "You want to tell me what that was all about, James?" Officer Martinez asked, moving further into the cafe with the measured steps of someone used to entering potentially volatile situations. His hand rested casually near his service weapon, a habit born from years of experience. James's fingers worked through Max's fur, finding the spot behind his ear that signaled, "Stand down." "Old ghosts coming back to haunt us, Rico," he replied, using Martinez's first name, a detail that caused several heads to turn. "Seems Operation Shadowbreak isn't as buried as we thought." Martinez's expression tightened at the mention of the operation. He pulled up a chair, positioning it to maintain clear sight lines to both the door and windows. "That explains why Reynolds looked like he'd seen a ghost when he spotted me," he said quietly. "Didn't expect to see him on this side of a prison wall." Sarah began moving through the cafe with purpose, righting chairs and restoring order to her domain. The construction workers gradually returned to their original positions, though their attention remained focused on the unfolding conversation. Linda had begun making quiet phone calls, her teacher's network spreading the word about potential trouble in the community. "The flash drive," James said suddenly, his hand reaching for where Reynolds had slammed it down. Mike stepped forward quickly, producing an evidence bag from his work vest, a detail that suggested his construction job might not be his only occupation. "I'll take that," Martinez said, accepting the bagged drive. "Might shed some light on why our old friend decided to surface after all these years." He paused, studying James's face. "You know this isn't over, right? Reynolds isn't the type to let go easily." Max shifted position, settling into a more relaxed but still vigilant stance beside James's chair. The dog's behavior reflected years of training, aware that the immediate threat had passed but ready for any contingency. The morning light caught his fur, highlighting the grey around his muzzle that spoke of years of service. "He never was good at letting things go," James agreed, his voice carrying a weight of memory. "That's what got us into this mess in the first place." He turned towards Sarah, who had returned to hover near their table. "I'm sorry about all this. Your cafe shouldn't have become a battlefield." Sarah waved off his apology with a decisive gesture. "This cafe has always been more than just a business, James. It's a sanctuary for our community." She began collecting abandoned coffee cups, her movements precise and purposeful. "And communities protect their own." The construction workers murmured in agreement, their presence still maintaining a subtle, protective perimeter. Mike pulled out his phone, sending quick texts presumably to contacts who needed to know about Reynolds' reappearance. "Speaking of protection," Martinez interjected, "we need to talk about security measures. Reynolds isn't working alone, those kinds of operations never are." He pulled out his notebook, years of police work evident in his methodical approach. "We need to document everything that happened here." Linda approached their table, her teacher's organizational skills already in motion. "I have photos," she said, holding up her phone, "and Sarah's security cameras caught everything." She paused, a slight smile crossing her face. "Some of us have learned a thing or two about gathering evidence over the years." The morning sun had risen higher, casting shorter shadows across the cafe floor. Regular customers had begun to return, drawn by concern and curiosity. Mrs. Chen from the flower shop entered with an armful of fresh flowers, her way of bringing beauty back to a space that had seen ugliness. "The community's already mobilizing," Mike reported, looking up from his phone. "We've got eyes on every street corner, and my team will be running extra patrols during their breaks." His casual mention of team carried implications beyond construction work. James absorbed this information silently, his hand never leaving Max's fur. The dog remained alert but calm, his professional training allowing him to adapt to the changing situation while maintaining his protective duties. Through the windows, life on Main Street had begun to return to normal, though observant eyes would notice increased activity among the local business owners. "We'll need to set up a proper security detail," Martinez said, making notes in his book. "And James, you might want to consider temporary relocation until we can—" "No," James interrupted firmly. "Reynolds wants us to run, to hide. That's not happening." His fingers found Max's ear again, the touch communicating volumes between handler and dog. "We stand our ground, here, with our community." The conviction in his voice seemed to settle. Something in the cafe. Sarah nodded approvingly as she continued her cleanup. The construction workers straightened their shoulders, and Linda began organizing what would clearly become a neighborhood watch schedule. Martinez studied James for a long moment before nodding. "All right," he conceded. "But we do this by the book. No lone wolf heroics." He cast a meaningful glance at Max. "Well, maybe one wolf, but you know what I mean." The tension in the cafe had begun to transform into something else. Determination, unity, purpose. The morning's events had shaken their peaceful routine, but instead of fracturing their community, it had strengthened it. Through the windows, the sun continued to rise over Main Street, illuminating a community that had chosen to stand together against a threat to one of their own. The walk home from Corner Cafe had always been a peaceful ritual for James and Max, a quiet time to transition from the social atmosphere of their morning coffee to the solitude of their daily routine. But today, every step felt different. The familiar route they'd traveled hundreds of times had transformed into something more complex, each corner and alley holding potential implications that hadn't existed hours before. Max moved with heightened awareness, his usual fluid gait replaced by a more measured pace. His training showed in the way he positioned himself slightly ahead of James, creating optimal coverage of their path while maintaining perfect leash. Tension. To casual observers, they might have looked like any other man and his service dog, but those with experience would recognize the tactical precision in their movement. Officer Martinez had insisted on following them in his patrol car, maintaining a discreet distance that provided security without drawing attention. The soft purr of his engine provided a constant reminder of the morning's events, a sound that seemed to echo off the buildings lining Main Street. "Steady, Max," James murmured as they approached the first intersection. The dog's ears twitched in acknowledgement, but his focus remained on their surroundings. A delivery truck backfired 2 blocks away, causing several pedestrians to jump. Max merely adjusted his position slightly, years of training allowing him to distinguish between actual threats and urban background noise. The morning had warmed considerably, sunshine creating patterns on the sidewalk through the trees that lined their route. These same trees that usually provided welcome shade now presented tactical considerations, their shadows potential hiding spots that Max scrutinized with professional attention. Each bus stop, each parked car, each recessed doorway received the same careful assessment. A group of joggers approached from the opposite direction, their casual morning exercise bringing them directly into James and Max's path. Without any obvious signal between them, Max guided James slightly to the right, creating additional space while maintaining protective positioning. The joggers passed without incident, but James could feel the tension in Max's body through the leash. "Looking sharp this morning, James," Deke called Mr. Peterson from his front porch, his daily greeting carrying extra weight today. The elderly veteran had already received calls from the community network that Linda had activated, and his presence on his porch was no coincidence. His sharp eyes scanned the street as James and Max passed. Another set of experienced observers added to their security. They were halfway home when Max's ears suddenly pricked forward, his stride shortening almost imperceptibly. James felt the change through the leash immediately, years of partnership allowing him to read his dog's signals clearly. "What is it, boy?" he asked quietly, trusting Max's instincts implicitly. The sound of a motorcycle engine growled in the distance, growing louder as it approached. Max maintained his pace, but shifted his position slightly, angling James toward the building side of the sidewalk. Martinez's patrol car edged closer, its presence more noticeable as the motorcycle sound intensified. The motorcycle passed them. At normal speed, its rider a teenager heading to school, but the moment highlighted how their world had changed in the space of one morning. Every similar sound would now carry echoes of Reynolds' threat, each engine note requiring assessment and response. As they turned onto their street, the neighborhood showed subtle signs of increased awareness. Mrs. Rodriguez was watering her flowers, something she usually did in the evening. Mr. Chang had chosen this morning to sweep his shop sidewalk personally rather than leaving it to his employees. Each familiar face carried an undercurrent of watchfulness, the community's protective network already in motion. Max guided them up the walkway to their front door with the same professional precision he'd maintained throughout their journey. His attention remained outward, covering their final approach, while James retrieved his keys. The morning sun caught the silver in Max's fur, a reminder that even experienced guardians felt the weight of renewed duty. "All clear inside," Martinez called softly from the patrol car, indicating that the property check he'd requested had been completed. James nodded in acknowledgement as he unlocked the door, appreciating the thoroughness of their protection while wishing it wasn't necessary. Inside their home, Max performed his own security sweep, moving from room to room with purposeful efficiency. His training showed in the systematic way he checked each space, his nose gathering information that human senses couldn't detect. James stood in the entryway, listening to his partner's movement through their home, the familiar sound now carrying new significance. When Max finally returned to James's side, his body language had shifted slightly, maintaining alertness while communicating that their immediate environment was secure. The morning sun streamed through their front windows, creating warm patches on the floor that would normally have invited relaxation. Today, those same patches of light served as tactical considerations, potential sources of visibility from outside. "Good boy," James murmured, finally allowing some of the morning's tension to ease from his shoulders. He unclipped Max's leash, but noted that the dog maintained his position near the door, rather than seeking his usual post-walk water bowl. Some habits, once reawakened, didn't easily fade. Outside, the sound of Martinez's patrol car idling provided a constant reminder of their new reality. The officer would maintain his post until the next security detail arrived, part of the protective network that had mobilized around them. Through their front window, James could hear the normal sounds of their neighborhood, children walking to school, cars heading to work, the distant rumble of the city bus. But now, each sound carried new weight, requiring evaluation and response. Max moved to the window, his posture professional rather than curious as he surveyed their front yard. His body blocked most of James's silhouette from outside view, a protective gesture that spoke volumes about his continued sense of duty. The morning light caught his alert eyes, reflecting years of training and service, now called back into active duty. The aftermath of the confrontation settled over Corner Cafe like a heavy blanket, transforming the once peaceful morning atmosphere into something more complex and charged. Reynolds and his companions had disappeared down Main Street, the sound of their motorcycles fading into the distance, but their presence had left an indelible mark on the community's sanctuary. The morning sun continued to stream through the cafe's windows, illuminating dust particles dancing in the air, as if the very atmosphere was still unsettled by what had transpired. Officer Martinez moved through the space with practiced efficiency, his notepad out as he collected statements from witnesses. His presence provided a sense of official authority, but everyone in the cafe understood that something more profound had occurred. A line had been drawn, a community had united, and a message had been sent. The regular customers who had stood their ground during the confrontation now moved with purpose, helping Sarah restore order to their beloved gathering place. James remained seated at his table, his hand never leaving Max's fur. The German shepherd maintained his vigilant posture, his training evident in the way he continuously scanned the cafe's entrance and windows. Though the immediate threat had passed, years of experience had taught Max that moments of apparent calm often preceded secondary attacks. His ears twitched at every sound, categorizing and assessing potential threats with professional precision. "The drive," Martinez said, carefully sealing the evidence bag containing Reynolds' parting gift. He studied it thoughtfully before continuing. "This could be exactly what we need to finally shut down whatever operation he's been running. 5 years is a long time to hold on to something like this." He glanced at James. Years of shared history, evident in his expression, unless, of course, it's exactly what he wants us to find. Sarah approached their table, fresh coffee in hand, though her movements were more measured than usual. "I've called Pete from the security company," she announced, setting the cup within James's reach. "He's coming by this afternoon to upgrade our system. HD cameras, motion sensors, the works." She paused, her voice softening. "This is your home too, James. We protect our own." The construction workers had begun to disperse, returning to their jobs with reluctance evident in their movements. Mike lingered behind, conferring quietly with Martinez. Their conversation, though hushed, carried the weight of professional assessment, security perimeters, patrol schedules, contingency plans. The morning's events had transformed Corner Cafe from a simple coffee shop into something more strategic, a focal point that needed to be defended. Linda approached James's table, her teacher's organizational skills already in full swing. "I've started a phone tree," she explained, her voice carrying the same authority she'd used to manage decades of unruly classrooms. "Everyone within 3 blocks will be connected. Any suspicious activity, any unfamiliar faces, we'll know about it." She placed a gentle hand on James's shoulder. "Reynolds may think he has the advantage, but he doesn't understand what community means." Max's ears suddenly pricked forward, his body tensing slightly. Conversations paused as the sound of another motorcycle engine approached, but it passed without slowing, a regular commuter, nothing more. Yet the moment highlighted how their world had shifted. Every similar sound would now require assessment, every stranger's face would need to be evaluated, every shadow would demand investigation. James absorbed these changes silently, his military training evident in the way he processed the tactical implications of their new reality. His fingers found the spot behind Max's ear that had long served as their private communication channel, conveying messages that went beyond words. The dog responded with a subtle shift in posture, maintaining his guard while acknowledging his handler's signal. "We'll need to adjust your schedule," Martinez said, closing his notebook with a decisive snap. "Different routes, varying times, basic counter-surveillance." He paused, studying his old friend's face. "Reynolds will be watching, gathering intel. We need to make that as difficult as possible for him." The morning sun had risen higher, casting shorter shadows across the cafe floor. Regular customers began to filter back in, drawn by concern and curiosity. Each new arrival was met with quiet nods of acknowledgement. The community's protective network already adapting to its new reality. Through the windows, Main Street had begun to return to its normal rhythm, though observant eyes would notice increased activity among the local business owners. Mrs. Chen from the flower shop next door entered, her arms full of fresh arrangements. Without a word, she began placing them around the cafe, her own way of reclaiming the space from the morning's darkness. The flowers' bright colors seemed to defy the lingering tension, their presence a reminder that beauty could persist even in the face of threat. James finally released his hold on Max's collar, though the dog maintained his protective position. "We can't let him change everything," he said quietly, his words carrying to those nearest. "This cafe, this community, it's what we fought to protect in the first place. If we let fear dictate our lives, Reynolds wins without firing a shot." The walk home from Corner Cafe took on a different character that morning, transforming from a peaceful daily ritual into a tactical exercise. James and Max moved with practiced precision through the familiar streets, their years of military training emerging in subtle ways that only experienced observers would notice. Officer Martinez followed at a discreet distance in his patrol car, his presence both reassuring and a stark reminder of their new reality. Max maintained perfect leash tension as they navigated the sidewalks, his body positioned slightly ahead and to the left of James, creating optimal coverage while maintaining their usual appearance of handler and service dog. His ears moved constantly, cataloging the urban symphony around them. The distant rumble of delivery trucks, the chatter of schoolchildren, the rustle of leaves in the spring breeze. Each sound received professional assessment, categorized as either routine or requiring further investigation. The neighborhood had already begun to respond to the morning's events, Linda's phone tree proving remarkably efficient. Mr. Peterson, a retired Marine sniper, happened to be tending his front garden as they passed, his experienced eyes scanning the street with purpose rather than casual interest. Mrs. Rodriguez had chosen this particular morning to sweep her entire sidewalk, her position providing clear sightlines down both approaches to her corner property. "Beautiful morning for a walk," Mr. Peterson called out, his voice carrying just enough to mask the sound of him speaking into the phone at his belt. James acknowledged the greeting with a nod, understanding that the comment was meant more for those watching than for him. Max's ears twitched at the exchange, but his focus remained on their surroundings, his training allowing him to distinguish between friendly conversation and potential threats. They were halfway home when the sound of approaching motorcycles caused every muscle in Max's body to tense. The dog maintained his pace, but adjusted his position slightly, angling James toward the building side of the sidewalk. Martinez's patrol car edged closer, its engine note changing, as the officer prepared for possible intervention. The motorcycles turned out to be a group of teenagers heading to school, but the moment highlighted how thoroughly their world had transformed in the space of a single morning. James felt the changes through Max's leash, the subtle shifts in tension, the microscopic adjustments in direction, the almost imperceptible variations in pace. Their years together, first in the military and then in civilian life, had created a language of touch and movement that went beyond words. Each signal carried meaning, each response acknowledged understanding, their partnership functioning with the precision of a finely tuned instrument. The local businesses along their route showed signs of the community's mobilization. Tom from the hardware store was suddenly very interested in adjusting his window display, his movements allowing him to maintain watch over the street. The convenience. Store owner had positioned his new security camera to cover more of the sidewalk, its installation suspiciously timely. Even the crossing guard at the school intersection seemed more alert, her usual friendly waves, accompanied by careful observation of approaching vehicles. As they turned onto their street, Max's posture shifted slightly, taking on the heightened awareness that James recognized from their military days. The dog's nose worked continuously, gathering information that human senses couldn't detect. Each parked car received careful scrutiny, each alleyway was assessed for potential threats, each shadow was evaluated as possible concealment. Martinez pulled ahead, completing a preliminary sweep of their property before positioning his patrol car with clear sightlines to both approaches. The officer's presence would remain until the next security detail arrived, part of the protective network that had mobilized around them. Through the morning air, James could hear the normal sounds of their neighborhood, children waiting for school buses, cars backing out of driveways, the distant rumble of garbage trucks. But now each sound carried new weight, requiring evaluation and response. "Clear on the perimeter," Martinez called softly as James and Max approached their front door. The words were professional, efficient, carrying echoes of their shared military background. Max maintained his alert posture. As James retrieved his keys, the dog's body positioned to provide maximum coverage during this vulnerable moment of transition. Inside their home, Max immediately began a security sweep, moving from room to room with purposeful efficiency. His training showed in the systematic way he checked each space, his nose gathering information that human senses couldn't detect. James stood in the entryway, listening to his partner's movement through their home, the familiar sound now carrying new significance. The morning sun streamed through their front windows, creating warm patches on the floor that would normally have invited relaxation. Today, those same patches of light served as tactical considerations, potential sources of visibility from outside. James moved through his home with careful steps, his military training emerging in the way he avoided silhouetting himself against windows or lingering in exposed positions. When Max finally returned to James's side, his body language had shifted slightly, maintaining alertness while communicating that their immediate environment was secure. The morning had taken on a surreal quality, their familiar home unchanged in its physical arrangement, but transformed in its tactical implications. Every window now represented a potential vulnerability, every external sound required assessment, every approaching footstep demanded identification. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through James's living room windows as he settled into his familiar armchair, the events of the morning weighing heavily on his thoughts. Max maintained his vigilant position near the front door, his posture reflecting years of professional training rather than the relaxed demeanor of a typical service dog. The house, normally a sanctuary from the outside world, had transformed into something more complex, a defensive position that required constant monitoring and assessment. Officer Martinez had established a rotation schedule with local law enforcement, ensuring continuous surveillance of the property. Through the windows, James could hear the subtle sound of patrol cars passing at regular intervals, their presence both reassuring and a reminder of the threat that lingered beyond their walls. The community's protective network had expanded throughout the day, with neighbors finding various reasons to be outdoors, their casual activities masking careful observation of the street. Max's ears suddenly pricked forward, his body tensing slightly as a vehicle slowed near their house. James remained still, trusting his partner's instincts as they had done countless times before. The sound of a delivery truck became apparent, followed by the familiar voice of their regular postal carrier greeting someone outside. Max's posture relaxed marginally, but his attention remained focused on the door, his training allowing no room for complacency. The afternoon mail delivery had become another layer in their security network. Tom, their postal carrier and a former Army Ranger, had volunteered to adjust his route, making their house his final stop. This arrangement allowed him to take extra time assessing the street, his uniform and familiar presence providing natural cover for surveillance. The sound of mail being delivered carried clearly through the front door, Tom's whistling a coded all-clear signal that both James and Max recognized from their military days. Inside the house, James methodically reviewed the security measures Martinez had helped implement. Each window had been fitted with subtle sensors, their installation rushed through by the local security company as a priority job. The backyard, once a simple recreational space, had been transformed into a carefully monitored zone, with motion-activated lights and cameras providing comprehensive coverage. Even the garden shed had been secured, preventing its use as a potential hiding spot. Max moved from his position by the door to complete another security sweep, his movements precise and purposeful. The dog's behavior had shifted subtly since the morning's confrontation, returning to patterns established during their military service. Each room received careful inspection, with particular attention paid to points of entry and potential vulnerabilities. The familiar sound of Max's methodical movement through the house provided a strange comfort to James, a reminder of their shared experiences and proven capability to handle dangerous situations. The phone rang, its sound sharp in the quiet. "House." Max paused his patrol, orienting toward James as he answered. Linda's voice came through clearly, her teacher's efficiency evident in her quick report. The neighborhood watch network had expanded throughout the day, with retired law enforcement officers and military veterans volunteering for regular patrols. Local businesses had shared their security camera feeds, creating a comprehensive surveillance network that covered most of Main Street and the surrounding areas. "We've got eyes everywhere," Linda assured him, her voice carrying the calm authority that had managed decades of unruly classrooms. "Mrs. Rodriguez has organized a schedule for the neighborhood's dog walkers. They'll maintain regular patrols without looking suspicious, and Mr. Peterson has offered his ham radio network for backup communication if needed." The level of organization was impressive, though not surprising given their community's background. As James ended the call, Max returned to his side, pressing gently against his leg in a gesture that communicated both support and readiness. The afternoon light had begun to fade, creating new patterns of shadow across their living room floor. These changing light conditions would require adjustments to their security posture, a fact that both man and dog acknowledged without need for discussion. Sarah from the cafe had arranged for dinner deliveries, ensuring they wouldn't need to leave the house unnecessarily. The local restaurants had quickly joined the support network, their delivery drivers briefed on security protocols and reporting procedures. Even this simple act of community care had been transformed into a tactical consideration, with delivery times varied randomly to prevent establishing predictable patterns. Through the windows, James could hear children playing in the distance, their normal afternoon activities continuing despite the day's events. The sound provided a poignant reminder of what they were protecting, not just their own safety, but the peace and security of their entire community. Max's ears twitched at the children's laughter, but his professional focus never wavered from his protective duties. The late afternoon brought a series of check-ins from their expanding security network. Mike's construction crew had finished their workday, strategically positioning their equipment to provide additional surveillance coverage of the surrounding streets. The local security company had expedited the installation of enhanced systems at Corner Cafe, ensuring Sarah's business would be protected against any potential retaliation. As evening approached, the changing light created new tactical considerations. Max moved to adjust his position, compensating for the longer shadows and reduced visibility. His training showed in the way he maintained optimal coverage while preserving his energy. This was not a sprint, but a marathon, a long-term security operation requiring sustained vigilance. The superficial calm of their neighborhood masked an underlying current of tension and preparation. behind drawn curtains and closed. Doors, plans were being refined, communications networks established, and security measures enhanced. The community had transformed into something Reynolds couldn't have anticipated. Not just a collection of neighbors, but a coordinated defensive network drawing on years of combined military and law enforcement experience. The first sign that something had changed came shortly after sunset. Max's behavior shifted subtly, his ears tracking something beyond the range of human hearing. James, attuned to his partner's signals after years of service together, noticed the change immediately. The dog's muscles had tensed beneath his fur, his attention focused on the kitchen window with professional intensity. Through the evening, shadows, the sound of a motorcycle engine growled in the distance, its note somehow different from the usual traffic. Officer Martinez's voice crackled over the secure radio he had left with them. "Movement on Cedar Street," he reported, his tone carrying the controlled urgency of a veteran law enforcement officer. 2 motorcycles, matching the description. From this morning, they're maintaining distance, but definitely conducting surveillance. The implications hung heavily in the darkening room. Reynolds was making his first moves. Max moved to the window with practiced efficiency, positioning himself to observe while minimizing his visibility from outside. His training showed in every line of his body, the way he used the curtains for cover while maintaining clear sightlines to the street. James listened intently, years of military experience allowing him to track the motorcycle's movement through sound alone. They were being systematic, methodical in their reconnaissance. Linda's phone tree activated within minutes. Reports began filtering in through their security network. Unfamiliar vehicles noted in adjacent neighborhoods, suspicious individuals, photographing buildings along Main Street, unusual activity around the local coffee shop. The pattern was clear. Reynolds wasn't working alone. He had assembled a team, and they were mapping out the community's layout and routines. "We've got eyes on 4 different motorcycles now," Mike reported through the radio, his construction experience lending authority to his observations. They're coordinating their movements, using hand signals. These aren't random riders. They're conducting professional surveillance. The sound of his crew's equipment being strategically repositioned carried through the background of his transmission. James felt Max press against his leg, the dog's subtle signal that someone was approaching their property. Through the front window, a jogger passed by, except the rhythm of their footsteps didn't match typical running patterns. Max's ears tracked the movement, his body language confirming James's suspicion. Another surveillance operative, this one on foot, testing their perimeter security. Sarah's voice joined the radio traffic, her usual warmth replaced by focused precision. "They've got someone watching the cafe," she reported. "Woman in business attire who's been working on a laptop for 3 hours. She's photographing everyone who enters or leaves." The cafe owner's observation skills, honed by years of managing a community gathering space, had proven invaluable to their security network. Martinez's patrol car rolled past, its presence a reminder of official protection, but James recognized the tactical situation was evolving. Reynolds was probing their defenses, testing response times, identifying patterns and vulnerabilities. It was a methodical approach that spoke of military training, the same training that James and Max had received. The evening deepened, bringing new tactical considerations. Streetlights created pools of illumination that could either expose or conceal, depending on how they were used. Max adjusted his position as the lighting changed, maintaining optimal coverage while preserving his night vision. His military training was evident in the way he processed each new shadow, each subtle movement, each unexpected sound. Through their security network, a more complex picture began to emerge. Reynolds's team wasn't just conducting surveillance, they were establishing a presence, marking territory. Local businesses reported subtle intimidation attempts. Parking spaces near strategic locations were being occupied by unfamiliar vehicles. The message was clear. The community's protective response had been anticipated and would be countered. "They're testing our communications," Linda reported, her teacher's analytical skills proving surprisingly applicable to security assessment. "We've detected attempts to monitor our phone tree. They're tracking patterns, trying to identify key nodes in our network." The sophistication of these efforts confirmed what James had suspected. Reynolds had maintained his military connections and resources. Max suddenly shifted position, moving to the back of the house with focused intent. James followed, trusting his partner's instincts. Through the kitchen window, movement caught his attention. A shadow that didn't match the natural patterns of evening light. Martinez's voice came through immediately on the radio. "Contact in the alley, single individual, moving with purpose, local units responding." The community's response was immediate but measured. Porch lights began turning, on in sequence, eliminating potential hiding spots. Dog walkers emerged from various directions, their casual evening routines providing cover for close observation. Mr. Peterson's ham radio network hummed with encrypted activity, coordinating responses while avoiding monitored communications. Channels. James felt the familiar weight of command settling onto his shoulders. Their home had become a tactical operations center, their peaceful neighborhood transformed into contested territory. Max maintained his vigilant watch, his presence a reminder of their shared combat experience and the skills that experience had burned into muscle memory. The evening had become a complex dance of observation and counter-observation, probe and response, action and reaction. Reynolds' team was professional, disciplined and well-resourced. But they had underestimated the community they were facing, a community that had its own resources, its own training and its own determination to protect its own. The confrontation they had been anticipating arrived at precisely 9:47 p.m., when Max's posture suddenly transformed from alert watchfulness to combat readiness. James recognized the change immediately. This wasn't a response to routine surveillance, but a reaction to immediate threat. Through the evening darkness, the sound of multiple motorcycles approached from different directions. They're synchronized. Arrival suggesting coordinated action. Multiple contacts converging, Martinez's voice reported through the radio, his professional calm masking the urgency of the situation. 4 motorcycles, 8 individuals total. They're blocking intersection access points. The tactical implications were clear. Reynolds had moved beyond surveillance to active containment. The community's security network crackled with activity. As observers reported similar movements throughout the neighborhood, Max moved to the center of the living room, positioning himself for optimal response to any entry point. His military training was evident in every line of his body, every subtle shift of muscle beneath fur. James could feel the tension through the floor, the slight vibrations of approaching footsteps, the measured movements of professional operators taking position around their house. Sarah's voice cut through the radio traffic. 2 more motorcycles at the cafe. They're not even trying to be subtle anymore. The sound of breaking glass punctuated her report, followed by the sharp wail of security alarms. "They're creating a diversion," she added, her voice tight with controlled anger. "Trying to split our response." James felt, rather than heard, the approach to their back door, the subtle change in air pressure that preceded attempted entry. Max was already moving, his reaction preceding James's awareness by crucial seconds. The dog's warning growl carried authority and promise, a clear message to anyone with the training to understand it. Through the kitchen window, shadows moved with military precision, testing angles and approaches. "Teams in position," Mike reported from his observation post. "Construction equipment blocking their escape routes. Mr. Peterson's got overwatch." from his second floor. The community's defensive network had activated fully, their response reflecting years of combined tactical experience. Linda's voice joined the transmission. "School security cameras are active. We've got full coverage of the north approach." Reynolds' voice cut through the darkness, carrying from just beyond the back door. "Coming in for a friendly visit, James?" he called, his tone carrying mock casualness that barely masked underlying tension. "Time we finished our morning conversation." The words were aimed at James, but Max's ears tracked multiple positions. Reynolds wasn't alone, and his team was establishing a perimeter. Martinez's patrol car rolled past the front of the house, its presence a reminder of official authority, but James understood the tactical reality. Reynolds had chosen his moment carefully, coordinating multiple actions to strain law enforcement response capabilities. The breaking glass at the cafe had been just the beginning. Reports were coming in of disturbances throughout the neighborhood, each one requiring police attention. "Last chance to handle this quietly," Reynolds continued, his voice closer. "Now, just you, me, and that remarkable dog of yours. We can sort out old grievances like professionals." The offer carried dangerous implications. Reynolds was offering a contained confrontation while his team maintained perimeter control. It was a tactical approach that spoke of military planning and resource coordination. Max's posture shifted slightly, adjusting to track multiple threats. His training allowed him to maintain focus on Reynolds while monitoring the movement of other operators around the house. James felt the subtle changes in the dog's body language, the microscopic muscle tensions that preceded action, the controlled breathing that marked combat readiness. The community's response evolved with practiced coordination. Porch lights began switching off in sequence, eliminating backlight that could silhouette defenders. The subtle sounds of security teams moving into position carried through the darkness, veterans and former law enforcement officers taking up tactical positions throughout the neighborhood. Mr. Peterson's ham radio network hummed with encrypted communications, coordinating responses while avoiding monitored channels. "Think carefully about your next move, Reynolds," James called back, his voice steady. "This isn't Fort Benning anymore. That operation you're protecting, the one that cost me my sight, it's not worth what's coming." His words carried clearly through the evening air, meant not just for Reynolds, but for anyone else listening. The stakes had moved beyond personal confrontation to something larger. Reynolds' laugh carried a sharp edge. "Always the tactical thinker, weren't you? But you're not seeing the whole picture. Ironic, given your condition." The sound of breaking glass from another part of the neighborhood punctuated his words. "How many fronts can your community defend, James? How thin can you stretch your response before something breaks?" Max's growl deepened, responding to a subtle movement near the side window. The sound carried professional warning rather than animal aggression, a clear message that boundaries were being tested and would be enforced. Through the radio, reports continued to flow. Suspicious packages being discovered near key locations, attempts to access utility controls, coordinated efforts to disrupt communication networks. The confrontation had evolved beyond a simple show, a force into something more complex, a test of resources, preparation, and community resilience. Reynolds had brought military precision and coordinated assets, but he was facing a response that drew on decades of combined tactical experience. The night air hummed with tension as both sides measured options and calculated risks. The crisis reached its apex at exactly 10:23 p.m. when the neighborhood's power grid suddenly went dark. The carefully coordinated blackout plunged their defensive network into momentary chaos as backup systems engaged. Through the sudden darkness, Max's muscles tensed beneath James's hand, the dog's training allowing him to adjust instantly to the tactical shift. The night vision equipment Reynolds's team had been concealing became evident as green laser dots appeared briefly on walls and windows. Professional operators taking firing positions. Grid failure across 6 blocks, Martinez reported through the radio, his voice tight with controlled urgency. Backup generators at key points are compromised. Someone accessed the maintenance tunnels. The implications were clear. Reynolds had planned this operation meticulously, using the earlier distractions to position teams throughout the infrastructure network. The community's defensive preparations were being systematically isolated and nullified. Max's warning growl deepened as shadows moved with renewed purpose around the house. The dog's military training showed in his measured responses. No wasted energy, no unnecessary movement, every muscle coiled and ready. James felt the change in air pressure as multiple breach points were prepared simultaneously. Reynolds wasn't just testing their defenses anymore. He was executing a coordinated assault plan. Full breach in progress at the cafe. Sarah's voice crackled through the radio. They're not after money, they're accessing the basement. Her report carried special significance. The cafe's basement had once housed a secure server room during its previous life as a government relay station. The pieces of Reynolds' true plan began falling into place with dangerous clarity. Reynolds' voice carried through the darkness, closer now and filled with cold satisfaction. You're starting to understand, aren't you, James? The cafe distraction. The community pressure, the power grid, it was never about our old grievances. You and that remarkable dog of yours were just one piece of a much larger operation. The sound of breaching charges being set punctuated his words. Linda's voice cut through the radio static. Multiple vehicles approaching from the north. Heavy equipment. They're not even trying to be subtle anymore. The community's security network reported similar movements throughout the neighborhood. Systematic isolation of key points, communication disruption, coordinated pressure on defensive positions. Reynolds had transformed their quiet community into a tactical battleground. Max suddenly shifted position, responding to threats that even James's trained senses couldn't detect. The dog's movement spoke of years of combat experience, positioning for optimal response while maintaining protective coverage. Through the darkness, the sound of multiple teams taking final positions created a symphony of subtle tactical cues that only veterans would recognize. The flash drive was a plant, Martinez transmitted, his voice carrying the weight of realization. The data wasn't about past operations. It was a Trojan horse. They used our analysis to map the neighborhood's security infrastructure. The sophistication of Reynolds' plan became apparent. Every defensive measure they'd implemented had been monitored, analyzed, and countered. James felt the tactical situation deteriorating rapidly. The community's coordinated defense was being systematically dismantled, their careful preparations turned against them. Reynolds had orchestrated a masterful deception, using their response to the morning's confrontation to identify and target key defensive positions. Now, with power cut and communications compromised, the true operation was unfolding. You always were good at seeing the bigger picture, James, Reynolds called through the darkness. Ironic, really, given your current condition. But you missed it this time. That operation you and Max exposed 5 years ago? It never stopped. We just moved it deeper, spread it wider. Your little community here sits on a vital relay point, one we're about to reclaim. Max's muscles bunched beneath his fur as breaching charges were armed at multiple entry points. The dog's training allowed him to track multiple threats while maintaining protective position near James. Through the radio, the community's defensive network reported similar preparations throughout the neighborhood, synchronized breaching, attempts coordinated for maximum effect. Your neighbors put up an impressive defense, Reynolds continued, his voice carrying professional appreciation. Military veterans, law enforcement, intelligence backgrounds. You built quite a team. Here! But that's the beauty of it, James. Every defensive measure, every security protocol, every response pattern, it all helped us map the infrastructure we needed. Your community didn't just reveal its defenses, it showed us exactly where the old network nodes were hidden. The night air crackled with tension as final positions were taken. The community's defensive network reported multiple breach teams ready, their synchronized watches counting down to coordinated action. Max's growl carried through the darkness. Not a threat, but a promise. Years of military training condensed into pure defensive focus. The crisis had evolved beyond personal confrontation into something far more dangerous. Reynolds hadn't come to settle old scores. He had orchestrated a massive operation to reclaim vital infrastructure that had been hidden beneath their peaceful community. The morning's confrontation, the surveillance, the tactical probes, all had been elements of a sophisticated deception leading to this moment. The turning point emerged from an unexpected source. As Reynolds' teams prepared for their final breach, Sarah's voice cut through the radio static with sudden urgency. The cafe's original blueprints were wrong, she transmitted, her voice carrying the weight of crucial revelation. The basement layout they're working from, it's been modified. Martinez, remember that renovation project 3 years ago? The one that brought in all that specialized equipment? The significance of her words registered immediately with James. The cafe's renovation hadn't just been about updating the interior. It had been a carefully orchestrated operation to restructure the entire underground infrastructure. Martinez had coordinated it personally, using his connections from his time in military engineering. Max's ears shifted slightly, tracking new movements through the darkness. The dog's tactical training allowed him to maintain his defensive position while processing changing battlefield conditions. Through the radio, the community's security network began reporting subtle shifts in Reynolds' team formations, signs of uncertainty creeping into their previously coordinated movements. "They're working from outdated intel," Martinez confirmed, his voice tight with controlled excitement. "The server room they're targeting, it's been completely reconfigured. Every access point they're preparing to breach leads to a reinforced containment zone." The sophistication of the community's long-term planning began to emerge. What had appeared to be simple renovation work had actually been a comprehensive security upgrade, designed specifically for scenarios like this. Reynolds's voice carried through the darkness, but now there was an edge of uncertainty beneath his confident tone. "Last chance, James. Whatever modifications you've made, they won't be enough. We have the resources, the manpower, and the tactical advantage." His words were meant to project strength, but Max's subtle shift in posture suggested the dog sensed the first hints of doubt in their opponent's voice. Linda's network sprang into action with practiced coordination. "Backup power systems engaging. On my mark," she transmitted. "Real ones this time, not the decoys they compromised." The community's true defensive capabilities began to emerge, layers of redundancy and misdirection that had been carefully concealed beneath an appearance of ordinary civilian infrastructure. James felt the tactical situation shifting. The preparations Reynolds had studied and counted on had been elaborate decoys, designed to conceal the community's actual defensive measures. Every security camera they'd mapped, every patrol route they'd documented, every response pattern they'd analyzed, had been part of a sophisticated deception. "Officer Martinez," Mr. Peterson's voice joined the radio traffic, carrying the calm authority of someone used to commanding crisis situations. "I believe it's time to activate Protocol 7. The code phrase triggered immediate response throughout the community's security network. Lights began engaging in precise sequence. Not the main power grid Reynolds had compromised, but a secondary system that had been installed during the cafe's renovation. Max's posture shifted subtly, responding to new tactical options as illumination patterns changed. The dog's military training allowed him to adapt instantly to the altered battlefield conditions. Through the darkness, the sound of Reynolds's teams, adjusting their positions, betrayed growing confusion. Their carefully planned operation was encountering layers of security they hadn't anticipated. "You didn't just build a community here, James," Martinez transmitted, his voice carrying professional appreciation. "You built a fortress, disguised as a neighborhood. Every renovation project, every infrastructure upgrade, it was all part of a larger design." The sophisticated integration of civilian life and tactical preparation became apparent. The community hadn't just been defending itself, it had been carefully preparing for exactly this type of operation. Sarah's voice added crucial details. The cafe's basement isn't just reinforced, it's a self-contained security zone. Every access point they're targeting is monitored, every breach attempt is being recorded. They're not breaking in, they're being channeled exactly where we want them. The years of careful planning and coordination revealed themselves in layers, each defensive measure supporting the others in a comprehensive security matrix. Through the radio, reports began flowing. In from throughout the neighborhood, Reynolds' teams were encountering unexpected resistance at every turn. What had appeared to be vulnerable access points were actually hardened defensive positions. The infrastructure they thought they were compromising had been carefully designed to contain and control any breach attempt. Max suddenly shifted position, responding to new tactical opportunities. The dog's training allowed him to recognize the moment when defense could transition to controlled response. James felt the change through years of partnership. They weren't just surviving Reynolds' assault, they were about to turn it against him. "Your operation is compromised, Reynolds," James called through the darkness, his voice carrying calm authority. "Every move you've made tonight has been anticipated and prepared for. That network you're trying to reclaim, it's not just defended, it's been completely transformed. You're not breaking into a system, you're being systematically contained by one." The night air hummed with tension as the true tactical situation became clear. Reynolds hadn't just failed to breach their defenses, he had led his entire operation into an elaborate trap. The community's apparent vulnerability had been a carefully crafted illusion, designed to draw out exactly this type of sophisticated attack. The implementation of the community's true defensive plan began with precision and coordination that spoke of years of preparation. Through the calculated darkness, Max adjusted his position with professional efficiency, responding to tactical updates flowing through their security network. The dog's military training allowed him to recognize the shift from defensive containment to coordinated response, his posture reflecting readiness for the next phase of operations. "All teams in position," Martinez transmitted, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone executing a long-planned operation. "Containment zones are secure. Secondary power grid engaging in sectors 3 through 7. The carefully orchestrated response revealed layers of preparation that Reynolds' surveillance had never detected. Lights began activating in precise patterns, creating deliberate channels of movement while eliminating tactical advantages that Reynolds' team had counted on. Sarah's voice added crucial tactical information. "Cafe basement secured. Their breach teams are completely contained. In the secondary chambers, all access points to the primary infrastructure remain sealed and monitored." The sophistication of their defensive architecture became apparent. What had appeared to be vulnerable service tunnels were actually elaborate containment systems designed to isolate and control any intrusion attempt. Reynolds' voice carried, "Through the darkness, But the confidence had been replaced by growing realization. "You've been planning this for years," he called, professional appreciation mixing with frustration. Every renovation, every community project, it was all preparation. The civilian infrastructure is just the surface layer, isn't it? His words confirmed what their defensive network already knew. The tactical advantage had shifted decisively. Linda's coordination proved invaluable as the community's response unfolded. "All observation posts reporting synchronized activity," she transmitted. "Civilian volunteers are maintaining their positions, providing comprehensive coverage of every approach and exit route." The integration of professional tactical elements with civilian support demonstrated levels of preparation that went far beyond normal community organization. Max's ears suddenly tracked new movement, tactical teams taking position throughout the neighborhood. These weren't Reynolds operators, but rather community members revealing their true capabilities. Mr. Peterson's voice carried clearly through the radio. "Special response units in place. These aren't just veterans anymore, Reynolds. You're facing a coordinated defense force that's been training for exactly this scenario." James felt the tactical situation crystallizing around them. Every defensive position they had appeared. The yield had actually channeled Reynolds' teams exactly where the community wanted them. The power grid shutdown that seemed to compromise their security had instead activated hidden systems and protocols. Even the civilian response patterns that Reynolds had studied and counted on had been carefully crafted deceptions. "Your teams are isolated," Martinez transmitted on an open channel, ensuring Reynolds could hear every word. "Each breach attempt has separated them further, cutting off communication and support. That network architecture you were trying to access, it's been completely reconfigured. You're not attacking a system, you're being systematically processed by one." Through the radio, reports confirmed the effectiveness of their containment strategy. Reynolds operators were encountering sophisticated security measures at every turn. What had appeared to be vulnerable access points were actually hardened defensive positions, each one designed to further isolate and control intrusion attempts. Sarah's voice added another layer of tactical information. "Secondary security protocols engaging in the cafe sector. Every attempt to breach our infrastructure is being recorded and traced. Your entire operation is now documented, Reynolds." The implications were clear. They weren't just defending against the attack. They were gathering evidence and intelligence. With every move Reynolds' team made, Max shifted position again, responding to updated tactical requirements. The dog's training allowed him to anticipate and adapt to the evolving situation while maintaining optimal defensive coverage. Through years of partnership, James could read the subtle changes in Max's posture. They were transitioning from containment to active response. "This isn't just about protecting infrastructure," James called into the darkness, his voice carrying the weight of authority earned through years of service. "Every member of this community has been preparing for threats like this. That network you're trying to reclaim, it's been integrated into a comprehensive defense system that extends far beyond what you can see." The night air hummed with controlled tension as their true capabilities were revealed. Reynolds had committed his entire operation to what he thought was a sophisticated infiltration, only to discover that every move had been anticipated and prepared for. The community's apparent vulnerability had been a carefully crafted illusion, designed specifically to draw out and contain exactly this type of threat. "Final containment protocols initiated," Martinez transmitted. "All civilian response teams are clear of the engagement zones. Tactical units are in position for coordinated action." The systematic implementation of their defensive plan demonstrated levels of preparation and coordination that went far beyond normal community organization. Every element, from civilian volunteers to professional operators, had trained and prepared for this moment. Through the darkness, The sound of Reynolds' teams attempting to regroup carried clearly, but their movements now betrayed uncertainty and growing realization. The operation they had planned so carefully had been compromised not by tactical errors, but by fundamental miscalculation. They had prepared to breach a civilian infrastructure network only to find themselves contained within a sophisticated defense system that had been years in the making. The final confrontation unfolded with the precision of a carefully orchestrated operation. Through the tactical darkness, Max's posture shifted from defensive readiness to controlled aggression, his military training evident in every controlled movement. The dog's muscles tensed beneath his fur as Reynolds's increasingly desperate attempts to regain tactical advantage reached their inevitable conclusion. All breach teams contained, Martinez reported through the command network. Secondary security protocols have isolated each intrusion point. Reynolds operators are completely separated from their support structure. The sophisticated integration of their defensive systems had transformed what Reynolds intended as a coordinated assault into a series of isolated containment scenarios. Sarah's voice added crucial tactical information from the cafe sector. Their primary technical team is secured in the modified server room. Every attempt to access the old network architecture is being recorded and traced back to their origin points. The years of careful preparation revealed their true purpose, not just defending against attacks, but documenting and exposing the entire operation. Through the darkness, Reynolds's voice carried a mix of professional appreciation and growing desperation. "I underestimated the scope of your preparation, James," he called, his words echoing through the now silent neighborhood. "But you don't have the authority to maintain this level of security infrastructure. When this reaches official channels—" "That's where you're wrong again, Reynolds," Martinez interrupted, his voice carrying clearly through both the radio and the night air. "Everything here is fully sanctioned. That renovation project 3 years ago, it was a joint operation between military intelligence and civilian defense networks. Every modification, every security upgrade, every community integration protocol, it's all officially documented and approved." Max's ears tracked multiple movements through the darkness as tactical teams took their final positions. The dog's training allowed him to maintain protective coverage while monitoring the systematic containment of Reynolds' operation. Through years of partnership, James could read the subtle changes in Max's posture that indicated the shifting tactical situation. Linda's coordination network continued providing crucial updates. All civilian observation posts confirm complete containment. Reynolds's surveillance teams are identified and isolated. Local law enforcement has established a secure perimeter around the entire operational zone. The integration of civilian and professional elements demonstrated levels of preparation that went far beyond standard community defense protocols. "You still don't see the full picture, do you, Reynolds?" James called into the darkness, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had planned for this moment for years. This community wasn't just built around the old network. It was designed to protect something far more valuable. Every resident, every business, every renovation project has been part of a comprehensive security strategy. The night air crackled with tension as Reynolds's final options disappeared. His operators, scattered throughout the neighborhood in what they thought were advantageous positions, found themselves systematically contained by security measures they hadn't detected during months of surveillance. The sophisticated infrastructure they had intended to breach had been completely transformed, incorporating new technologies and protocols that rendered their tactical approach obsolete. Full activation of primary security grid confirmed. Martinez transmitted. All containment zones are secure. Evidence collection protocols are active and recording. The implementation of their final defensive measures revealed the true sophistication of their preparation. What had appeared to be a vulnerable civilian infrastructure had transformed into an integrated security system that extended throughout the entire community. Max suddenly shifted position, responding to a desperate movement in the darkness. Reynolds had abandoned his tactical position, making one final attempt to salvage his operation. The dog's reaction was immediate but controlled, years of military training allowing him to respond with precise force rather than aggression. Through their partnership, James could read every nuance of Max's movement. This wasn't just a trained response, but the culmination of years of preparation. "It's over, Reynolds," James announced, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Every member of your team is contained. Every piece of equipment you brought is tagged and tracked. Every communication you've made is recorded. This isn't just about stopping your operation, it's about exposing the entire network you've been protecting." Through the radio, Sarah confirmed the final phase of their response. Complete data package compiled and transmitted to secure channels. Every aspect of their operation is documented, from initial surveillance to final breach attempts. The evidence chain is complete and verified. The sophisticated integration of their security systems had transformed a defensive operation into a comprehensive intelligence-gathering exercise. The sound of multiple tactical teams moving into final position carried through the darkness. Reynolds' options had been systematically eliminated, his carefully planned operation now fully exposed and documented. The community's response had not just contained the immediate threat, but had gathered crucial intelligence that would have far-reaching implications for the broader network he had tried to protect. "You've spent years hiding behind military contracts and classified operations," Martinez transmitted on an open channel. "But this time everything is documented through official channels, the network you were trying to access. It's been recording and transmitting evidence of your entire operation from the moment you entered the perimeter." The culmination of years of preparation and training reached its final phase. Reynolds' attempt to reclaim what he thought was a vulnerable infrastructure node had instead exposed his entire operation to a sophisticated security system that had been designed specifically for this purpose. The quiet community he had dismissed as an easy target had revealed itself as something far more formidable, a fully integrated defense network disguised as a civilian neighborhood. The morning sun rose over a transformed neighborhood, its warm light revealing subtle changes that only careful observers would notice. Corner Cafe had already reopened its doors, Sarah's efficient management ensuring that regular customers found their usual morning routines undisturbed. Yet beneath the surface of normalcy, a deeper awareness had taken root, an understanding that their community was something far more significant than it appeared. Max maintained his professional vigilance as he guided James through their morning walk, the dog's training allowing him to balance protective duties with his regular service role. Their path to the cafe took them past evidence of the previous night's operation, construction equipment being relocated, security teams conducting final sweeps, and neighbors exchanging knowing glances that carried new meaning. "Everything's secured and documented," Martinez reported, joining them at their usual table. The officer's casual appearance masked the significance of his update. "Reynolds and his entire team are in custody. The evidence package has been processed through official channels. That network he was trying to protect, it's being dismantled systematically, using the intelligence we gathered." Sarah approached with their regular coffee order, her movements carrying the same efficiency they always had. But now there was an added layer of awareness in her interactions, a deeper understanding of her role in the community's defense network. The renovation cruise will be finished by noon, she mentioned, placing James's cup in its usual position. All systems tested and confirmed operational. Through the cafe's windows, the neighborhood showed subtle signs of its evolution. Mr. Peterson maintained his morning routine of tending his garden, but his positioning provided optimal coverage of the street approaches. The local business owners went about their usual activities while maintaining the enhanced security protocols that had proven so effective. Even the school crossing guards' routine had incorporated new elements of awareness and coordination. The community's response exceeded all expectations, Linda commented, joining their conversation with her usual teacher's punctuality. Her phone network had transformed from a simple communication chain into a sophisticated coordination system, integrating civilian observers with professional security elements. Every resident understood their role and executed it perfectly. Max's ears tracked the morning sounds with professional attention, his training allowing him to maintain surveillance while appearing to rest at James's feet. The dog's behavior reflected the community's new reality, maintaining normal routines while incorporating enhanced awareness and readiness. Through their partnership, James could feel the subtle changes in Max's posture that indicated continued vigilance beneath apparent relaxation. "The official report has been filed," Martinez added, his casual tone masking the significance of his words. "Everything documented through proper channels. The renovation project's true nature has been officially acknowledged. A joint civilian-military initiative to protect critical infrastructure through community integration." Sarah's cafe had returned to its role as the neighborhood's gathering place, but now it carried additional meaning. The renovated basement, with its sophisticated security systems and monitoring capabilities, represented a new model of community defense. Regular customers went about their morning routines, unconsciously following patterns that maintained optimal surveillance coverage. "The network Reynolds was trying to access," Martinez continued, his voice lowered for privacy. "It was just one part of a larger operation. But what we documented last night, the evidence we gathered during their breach attempt, it's enough to expose the entire system." His team didn't just fail to reclaim the old infrastructure, they compromised their entire operation. The morning light strengthened, casting familiar patterns through the cafe's windows. Regular customers continued their daily routines, their conversations carrying the comfortable rhythm of community life. Yet beneath this surface of normalcy, a new awareness had taken root, an understanding that their peaceful neighborhood represented something unique and valuable. "This community," James reflected, his hand resting on Max's fur, "it's more than just a defensive network or a security operation. It's a model for something new, integration of civilian life with professional protection without compromising either." The dog's steady presence emphasized his words, demonstrating how military precision could coexist with everyday service. Through the windows, the neighborhood continued its morning routines. Children walked to school, businesses opened their doors, and neighbors exchanged greetings. But now these familiar patterns carried deeper significance, each interaction representing layers of security and awareness that had proven their worth during the crisis. "The true strength of this community," Linda observed, "isn't in the security systems or tactical preparations. It's in the people who chose to stand together, who understood that protection doesn't require sacrificing the peace we're defending." Her words captured the essence of what they had built, a community that could maintain its warmth and openness while incorporating sophisticated defensive capabilities. As the morning progressed, the cafe filled with its regular crowd. The construction workers returned to their usual table, their work vests now carrying subtle indicators of their additional roles. Mrs. Chen delivered fresh flowers, their arrangement, providing natural coverage for new security features. Even Mr. Peterson's ham radio network had evolved, integrating civilian communication with professional coordination channels. Max adjusted his position slightly, maintaining optimal coverage while appearing to simply rest near James's chair. The dog's professional training showed in the way he balanced multiple duties: service animal, protective companion, and tactical asset. His presence embodied the community's new reality, maintaining normal life while incorporating enhanced awareness and capability. The morning sun continued its ascent, casting shorter shadows across the cafe floor. Regular customers came and went, following patterns that now served both civilian comfort and tactical advantage. Through it all, the community maintained its essential character, a peaceful neighborhood that had discovered its strength not in walls or weapons, but in the bonds between its members and their shared commitment to protecting what mattered most. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.